let me begin by welcoming everyone and 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 really thanking you all for coming along to this. And I particularly want to thank you for I want to thank my colleagues, John Raven and Megan, who have been very helpful in getting us to this point, and particularly with the technology. Megan has made this possible. I don't think we could have managed it otherwise. And I would just say that many of you will know that John and Megan are former students of mine, and I never thought we would ever work together as a group. So this has been a kind of unexpected pleasure. So the way we're going to do this is we've got a series of presentations, and these presentations have been pre-recorded so that they'll go smoothly. We'd like you to keep yourself quiet. Well, this is just really because we know from experience that Zoom doesn't really cope with lots of noise, and it's disruptive for the broadcasting. So just can do that. There's quite a lot of opportunities to contribute here. So there's a chat function which allows you to kind of say hi to people, but it's also where you can put, so you can address individuals or you can address everyone. I think if you have kind of serious questions or issues that you think are for very general attention, then that should go in the Q&A bit. And the idea is after the presentations, we will have a little bit of commentary, and then you will be able to identify hopefully some questions in the Q&A, and we'll pick that up and try to identify those ones which we will be able to address today. I think we're in a happy situation of being able to follow up some of this stuff, at least for those of people who are on the MERC committee. This will be a chance there'll be one more chance to actually think about some of the detail here when we meet next week. And obviously, I want to stress that this isn't the end of the show or the final moment. And particularly, I want to say that this material which relates to the development of the manifesto is being prepared to go up on a website, so that you'll be able to see, or people who aren't able to attend just now will be able to see that. And some of the comments and anything that goes in the Q&A bit will be captured and presented there as well. And for those of you who perhaps aren't on the MERC committee, please feel free to email me if there are questions or issues you think we should try to follow up in this as we're in this final stage of development. So I think that's this is what we're going to do. So there's a kind of introduction which will kick off in just a minute, and actually John Raven is absolved from this. Anything that's not felicitous, he has nothing to do with this. It's all my own fault. And then we have a series, and I'm not going to read them all, we'll see them in due course, of very interesting presentations. And I think the point about this is these are intended to be the kind of main case studies to support the argument of the manifesto. So hopefully they're going to be robust enough and appealing enough to do that work. That's maybe one of the things we are thinking about today. So I think that is the point at which we should begin to start sharing screens. And if Dr. Kasten can, this is like I feel like a DJ a wee bit. I'm selecting the next disc. So here's Bob Dylan's latest, or not quite.
Hello, this is Stephen Driscoll, and I want to welcome you to the second of our MERC Manifesto webinars. I will be introducing it by saying a few words about the origins and aspirations of the MERC Manifesto project. It seems appropriate that this public presentation of the manifesto should take place in Scotland, because much of the groundwork for this has actually taken place here. This is in particularly thanks to the grant from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, who allowed us to bring MERC members to come to Scotland, and also allowed some of us to attend the Bern EAA meeting. Now, I want to stress that while I am presenting this, this is really not all my work. This is a collaborative project, and so many people have been involved, and they've contributed so much that it's impossible to name them here. But I do want to say that I'm immensely grateful for all their efforts, and I'm astonished because their contributions were always constructive and supportive, and so it was a pleasure to work with everyone. We've tried to name the participants of the workshops on the Manifesto website. We are, of course, all familiar with the notion of a manifesto. It's familiar from politics, it's familiar from art, and I guess above all we would say a manifesto is a call for change. And to some extent, a manifesto can provide guidance to that change. This manifesto reflects the powerful desire for change within the community of European medieval archaeologists. From the outside, this concern for medieval pasts looks marginal. It looks like a tiny ecological niche in a vast socio-political biosphere. But for those of us who work in this field, this is our world. It is what we know. It is where we must begin to articulate our vision. The purpose of the manifesto hasn't changed hugely since we met in Bern to map out the beginnings of this, but it's clear that what we're after is building greater recognition of medieval archaeology, drawing attention to its unique capacity to inform and its potential and power to provide a critique of existing historical narratives. Our work, I guess, is also to disrupt the status quo within the profession and within the academic practices of medieval archaeology. And perhaps most ambitiously, we want to shape public discourse on medieval archaeology at a range of levels. It is, I think, necessary for us to say a word or two about who MERC is and how the manifesto has come together. Many of you will know, but not all of you, I suppose, that MERC is an organic group. In some ways, it's scarcely organized at all, if truth be told. MERC emerged following a series of major medieval archaeology congresses, first in York, organized by Martin Carver in '92, and then in Bruges by Frans Verhagen in '97. Although the following congresses were less well attended or successful, a collective identity as European medieval archaeologists was clearly forged at these meetings. Following a period of hibernation, MERC reawakened at the European Association of Archaeologists annual meeting in Helsinki in 2013. And this proved to be a turning point in recognizing our mutual interests and of realizing that the EAA provided a means to meet regularly. I believe that MERC is the largest self-conscious, perhaps we should say period-based group within the EAA. In 2017, while reflecting on our 25-year-long journey, which started in York, Those gathered at the MERC Forum in Maastricht spontaneously decided that we needed to identify our purpose more clearly. And it was decided that MERC needed to articulate a vision for medieval archaeology, one which was more equitable, just, and socially engaged. The motivations behind this desire for change for a manifesto varied widely across Europe, not surprisingly given the widely differing local political circumstances we find ourselves in. In some regions, it was driven by a frustration with decline in public services and increases in social inequality driven by neoliberal political agendas, while elsewhere the driver was the serious existential threats posed by the appropriation and misuse of the heritage by political extremists. In short, the manifesto arose from a dissatisfaction with the status quo, a status quo that will no longer exist after the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this respect, the core values represented by the manifesto seem to be even more urgently needed. And I hope that the manifesto actually its value has increased as a consequence of our current situation. I would say that if we have our key message here is that medieval archaeology is not niche, that medieval pasts are core business for everyone, because we inhabit worlds largely made in the Middle Ages. And the better we as a society know and appreciate this, the better we can make use of these fundamental cultural resources. So this process we've started really in 2017 has seen a series of workshops held in Glasgow and Bern, and now we're at the point of launching this. We have to recognize that we did not start to construct our vision on a blank sheet of paper. We freely drew upon Scotland's archaeology strategy. This was a convenient starting place because I had been involved with drafting it and knew that it went through a rigorous consultation process, and moreover, it has proven to be a success in delivering improvements in all sectors of Scottish archaeology. The structuring principles of the Scotland's archaeology strategy remain evident in our manifesto, which we hope to publish next month. So these aims will be echoed in the manifesto. Our draft cover features the fire at Notre Dame, and I think this conveys the fragility of the material remains of the medieval past very effectively, and particularly emphasizes that even those substantial permanent edifices, such as a cathedral, are not protected from all possible loss. The relationship between the guiding principles of the manifesto are conceived of as a virtuous circle, and in today's session we will look at case studies which illustrate these principles, which are found in each of the quadrants here: creating knowledge, understanding value, caring, and protecting. And the idea is that as we create knowledge and understanding, it helps us to understand values, and these are very specific values which relate to our material, and they in turn allow us to care and protect for these resources better, and that if they're cared for, protected, then they're available to be engaged with and to be enjoyed, and that interest and enjoyment contributes to a desire to create more knowledge and greater understanding. We also recognize that in order to do this effectively, we need more capacity at all sorts of levels, and this is something which relates to every aspect of the circle. And I think on reflecting on how this is developed, one of the key challenges we can identify is to explain the intrinsic values found in medieval archaeology and how these are revealed through our practice. Before we move on to look at the case studies which help us to understand the values which we're promoting in the manifesto, I think it's worth saying a couple of words about Scotland's medieval borough survey. And this is really to draw out a couple of observations which arose during the webinar last week. The Scottish borough survey experience is actually significant because it's very unusual in Europe. It's a national project to map and all the archaeological and medieval archaeological resources above and below ground in all of Scotland's medieval towns. And it was prompted by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 1972, and it went through 3 phases of development, starting with a very rapid survey distinguished by these very plain and cut and paste aesthetic kind of surveys. These were intended to help local communities and decision makers to care for their own historic towns. And the history of this project can be pursued in this article here. Later volumes were more detailed and more attractive and more widely accessible and better published, properly published. 2 points emerged from our discussion last week which are worth reflecting on. Firstly, initially these surveys were exclusively management tools with no community involvement, no public audience to speak of. However, as time went on, it turned out that there was a significant public interest in these matters, and people were gradually drawn into the process of not just reading and using these things, but creating them. And in the most recent examples, a considerable investment really has been made in training members of the public to a level that they're able to actively contribute to the survey, whether it's working with archives, working with documents, or the results of excavations. And this has greatly enriched the process because people are actually interested and engaged in a way which they weren't in the first phase. And secondly, in discussion, it was pointed out that while the survey was good at identifying old things, medieval things, and providing protection for them, and it was not very effective at creating value, particularly with respect to more fluid concepts such as placemaking. And I think this is relevant because it helps to identify those particular challenges we're going to face when we come to use this manifesto. Over the next couple of hours, we will look at the principles which underpin the manifesto through a series of case studies which have kindly been presented for us by colleagues from across Europe. And following that series of case studies, we will have some structured commentary from discussants and including some of the people who have presented. And following that, we will create the opportunity for some questions and answers. So I hope it fulfills your expectations.
Great, good start. Good start. Well, anyway, thank you for your attention there, and hopefully that's kind of framed things for us. I want to just kind of move straight on to looking at the work which Professor Gitte Hansen is providing us, and she's working or started work at this amazing excavation at Borgund, Kaupang in Western Norway, and she has a very smart film which we're about to see. So take it away, Megan.
Hi, my name is Gitte. I'll tell you about the Borgund Kaupang project, which we recently started at the University Museum in Borgund in Western Norway. In the Borgund project, we are not excavating anything from the soil. Instead, we dig into the museum's archives and storerooms. This is because the Borgund Kaupang project is all about legacy data. The Borgund excavations were Norway's first medieval archaeological excavation, and the data we are analyzing were collected mostly during the 1950s and 60s. So, in this presentation, I'll talk about Norway's first medieval archaeological excavation, and I'll tell about the research project, why and how we studied the thousands of archaeological finds from Borgund. Borgund was a medieval town. It was located on the west coast of Norway, outside today's town Ålesund. Here we see the Borgund meadow, where most of the remains of the town still lie under the grass. Borgund is halfway between the well-known big medieval towns Bergen and Trondheim. In Norway, there were only 14 towns during the Middle Ages, and Borgund was a medium-sized town by Norwegian standards. The written sources relate that there were 3 or 4 churches here. Borgund is mentioned in the sagas and may date back to the last part of the 900s, that is, the late Viking Age. In 1570, we hear about the place for the last time in written records. And then the town was deserted sometime after this. In time, the precise location of the town was forgotten. And it was not until almost 400 years later, in 1953, that medieval small finds turned up on the meadows outside Ålesund. Soon it turned out that Borgund of the sagas had been found. And locally, excitement was big. Soon expertise from the University of Bergen was summoned. Before 1954, archaeologists had not paid much attention to the medieval period as an archaeological field of research. So, the meadow became the site for Norway's first medieval archaeological excavation. The archaeologist who came to work and direct the excavations in Borgund from 1954 until the 1980s was Asbjørn E. Herteig. Herteig is perhaps better known for his pioneering work on the German wharf in Bergen. But Herteig and his crew and colleagues spent summer weeks in Borgund while also excavating year-round in Bergen. Under Herteig's supervision, medieval ordinary people's houses and homes were now excavated and investigated for the first time. And modern medieval archaeology was born. Excavations continued every year in Borgund throughout the 1950s and 60s. Later, there has also been smaller scale investigations, and all in all, archaeologists have worked in Borgund for more than 30 field seasons. Today, Borgund boasts Norway's largest medieval find assemblage outside the big medieval towns. 5,300 square meters were uncovered, more than 45,000 objects, and a similar amount of human and animal bones were found. 300 early Christian graves were found, and as much as 3 or 4 churches. Many of the finds are shown and disseminated in the in situ exhibition of the site at Sundmøre Museum outside Ålesund. Little primary research has been done since the early 1970s, and with a large amount of archaeological finds and today's methods, the potential for new knowledge is tremendous. In August 2019, we started up the Borgund Kaupang research project. We are a large cross-disciplinary team, cultural and natural historians, as well as craftspeople from different institutions in several countries. The project kick-started with generous funding from the Research Council of Norway, and this funding covers 2 PhD scholarships, natural scientific analysis, and about a year's wages for curation. Many of the team members have own funding and participate with their expertise. In this way, one can say that the project is partially crowd-funded. We are very excited that we're going to work together on the almost legendary sources from Borgund, and we'll carry on for 4 years till 2024. With many team members from various disciplines, the project has several sub-studies, but a common focus is on the everyday life of the ordinary people who lived here in the outskirts of Europe during the late Viking Age and during the medieval period. The people in Borgund are our case study. We ask, who were they in terms of how did they make a living? What were their trades? And were they men, women, children? So questions about demography. And were they rich or poor, or perhaps something in between? And what were their connection to the rest of the world? Did they keep themselves to themselves? Or were they outward looking, keeping up with trends and lifestyle in the world beyond? And how did this change during the years from the late Viking Age till abandonment of the town some 500 years later? So, what do we do to answer these questions? We dig out new information about the old finds in the storerooms and archives. Our project is concerned with how to get the most out of legacy data so that we can find out most about the people who lived in the past. The old excavations of Borgund were innovative for their time. And as already mentioned, ordinary medieval people's living quarters were excavated for the first time in Norwegian archaeological history. Everything was collected. There were both exotic foreign things, there were fancy domestic things, and there were everyday household things. Even production waste was collected. There was collaboration between archaeologists and natural scientists, and samples were collected for future analysis. All together is spectacular finds and just waiting to be analyzed. All documentation from the excavations are of course 1950s and 60s standard, including the classification of objects. We have lots of basic archaeological work to do so we can answer the questions of when and where, and then eventually turn to the more complicated questions of how and why. So what do? We study and digitize plan drawings to get an overview of where major structures were found. Here, for instance, we see part of the drainage system, but we also digitize buildings and roads and graveyards and so on. And we also make distribution maps of object types, so what was found where. And we reclassify objects. Everyday objects from the Middle Ages were still not known to the archaeologists in the 1950s and 60s. For instance, this little man made headlines as an exotic find. But today we know that this is a quite common piece from a high medieval jug from Yorkshire in England. So we reclassify objects according to today's knowledge, but also, of course, according to the questions we want to answer. One basic question is, of course, dating. We want to find out how old the settlement is. We want to find out about the beginning. How far does it extend back into the Viking Ages? We want to find out about the end. When was the town abandoned? But we also need to dissolve the many structures and cultural layers into more or less contemporary horizons. We have a comprehensive program for dating by carbon 14. So a first thing we did in autumn 2019 was to identify and sample organic materials. Here a log from the first harbour structure in Borgund is sampled. And as we can see, the preservation conditions for wood were fantastic. We have also sampled textiles and leather shoes and bird bones, to mention some. We also study objects which can be dated by typology. Here the about 10,000 pieces of pottery from all over Europe are very important. But also objects such as coins or combs and shoes, and of course the finer stuff with ornamental details which can be dated. We also want to find out where things come from, and we provenance objects and raw materials. We ask, were they sourced locally, or did they come from distant places in Norway, or perhaps from the world abroad? Provenance can tell us about what kind of contacts the people of Borgund had. We study objects which have a known production site, such as, for instance, the pottery again, or such as the cones. We combine the typological studies with natural scientific methods for identifying materials and provenancing. For instance, textiles, the clothes people wore. The weave is studied and the provenance of the wool is analyzed through isotope analysis. We also ask, what leather did the Borgund folks use in their shoes? Did they use domesticated animals like cow or goat or horse? Or did they use wild animals like deer? Or both? And then we also provenance things of stone and wood, which people used in their households or in production. Examples of such are homes, which may have come from distant parts of Norway. Other examples are soapstone vessels, and marble for the churches, or wood for the houses. We find out how things were made and what they were used for. For example, we're interested in the production and use of iron. Here we see some slag from iron working, and some tools and some things of iron. The craftspeople in the project study ancient weaving techniques. Here's a discussion about a varefell textile. A varefell was like a warm, shaggy raincoat for folks on the sea. And here's a reconstruction. We're interested in what and how people ate and drank. So we study kitchen and tablewares, as well as animal bones. And then we study the dead people by looking at their burials and their remains. And through shoes for children and, for instance, textile tools, we assess the demographic composition of the town's people. Exploring legacy data is a lot of work, but it's also super interesting and rewarding. Much still has to be done in the Borgund Kaupang project. We had a very busy hands-on schedule for 2020. Much digging to do in the archives, much digging to do in the storerooms, and much lab work. But then the corona pandemic came and we've had to reschedule some. But we are optimists. We are still in the beginning of our project and we will be carrying on until 2024. So, wish us good luck and follow us on our webpage and on Facebook. There you can read about the different sub-studies and about our progress, and soon also about our results.
Well, that's a great start, and it's maybe not surprising that Gitte is able to bring together such a nicely integrated project. She's been, of course, a very prominent supporter of the, if you like, revived MERC group, and has for many years served on the editorial board for the European Journal of Archaeology. So it's nice having to see her actually in her home element there and telling us about the strength of that. So the next presentation we're going to have is by Dries. Dries Thies is the professor of medieval archaeology and landscape history at the Free University in Brussels, and he's going to be telling, and he's currently, of course, the president of MERC, and he is ideally placed to tell us about the work they're doing, trying to have a better understanding of who made up the medieval city in the Low Countries. So maybe we'll have that now.
Good afternoon. My name is Dries and I present to you in the name of this consortium a presentation on our new project called Makeup of the City, which includes a transdisciplinary study of urban society in the medieval, pre-modern Low Countries. It's specifically for the aim about the understanding scientific value in the manifesto that we were asked to present our project. That aim, understanding scientific value, is about how medieval archaeology matters beyond the field of archaeology, how it can strengthen how it can strengthen medieval archaeology, but also how it can contribute to shaping a better post-pandemic world by, for instance, studying pandemics and diseases in the Middle Ages. Specifically, the manifesto says that the evidence that medieval archaeology can help to study environmental change regarding, for instance, landscape and past land use, but also changes in human health, which can be precisely dated, which can be measured, and can be set within a narrative context. And our project, Makeup of the City, is aimed at specifically one environmental change. So if you want to put it like that, namely, what does it mean to become urban? The phenomenon of the urban revolution, the medieval urban revolution. The question would then be how urbanism, how living in an urban environment according to an urban rhythm in certain non-rural social economic conditions with time pressure, for instance, affected human health conditions. How did workload, working hour by hour, how did stress, how did poverty, food shortages, age affect human health conditions? How was healthcare organized, and what was the result of epidemics in this dense world of the towns, towns and cities? For instance, skeletons can indeed tell us, burials and human bodies can give us information about poverty via the Harris lines, or about healthcare. Look, for instance, at this healed broken bone, or not healed, I should say. Look at the burial conditions, the demographic overflow that often made it very difficult to organize burials in urban context, but also syphilis in the middle down, or epidemics. The rest of the images were part of the health danger and the health issues in the medieval town or towns. And we want to ask this question for medieval Flanders. Medieval Flanders, which was then, as it is now, one of the most urbanized parts of the world. This map shows you all the medieval towns that originated between the 10th and 15th century on the surface of one county only. It has famous towns such as Ghent and Bruges for tourism, and Ypres for the well-known reasons, namely World War I tourism. And it was studied extensively and intensively by famous international scholars such as Henri Pirenne and others. Indeed, the cities and the towns, the large towns in the pre-modern Low Countries, were a very distinguishing feature of society, and they got a lot of worldwide scholarly attention, mainly from the historical side as well as the art historical side, because these late medieval towns were depicted by the Flemish primitive masters, for instance. But questions about the population were far more rare. We still have questions regarding gender and age distribution, so demography, the origins of the urban population, where did they actually come from, because our towns were quite large. Ghent had 60,000 inhabitants in the 13th and 14th century, 60,000. Bruges had 45,000, Ypres had 30,000 inhabitants, which is far more than London and Köln at the same time, in the same period. We can study, of course, pathologies and diets and nutritions. Now, but all these things, diet, nutrition, health, pathologies, origins and migration patterns, etc., well, they are not really well documented via the written sources, via the archival sources. We have a lack of data, and it's an historian who wrote this, Bart Lambert, who is part of the project team. But indeed, historians often have the tendency not to go the interdisciplinary way. There's a lack of interdisciplinarity in all these historical studies. And we want to address this research problem to the medieval city of Ypres. It was a 13th century boom town. It originated as a comital castle with a year market on the green, with a church, but high medieval Ypres in the 11th and 12th century was quite small, and in the 13th century, due to this year market probably, it boomed and became one of the largest cities in Europe, or a top 10 city in medieval Europe. It became also an industrial giant. It was famous for its cloth production that was traded all over Europe. One of the problems, though, with Ypres is World War I, which destroyed the city, but also the city archives, so there is a lack of written sources because the medieval archives were all destroyed. There is, however, archaeology, medieval archaeology, and medieval archaeology has so far given us information about labor quarters, about the cloth production. It has given us a lot of information about pilgrim badges, for instance, but also, like I said, cloth production. We know about the cloth seals, we know in which quarters the cloth producers lived, we know about parasites in their cesspits, which reflected the fact that they worked with sheep wool. We have even the pedal of a loom. So we are more or less informed about the economy which is also reflected in historical studies, cloth production, textile production. But we did not have for a long time information about the population. And 2 years ago, a large urban cemetery was excavated in the St. Nicholas parish. You see it on the fall on the map, and you see the St. Nicholas Church and the burial ground around it on the historical map on the right side. And in that burial ground, 1200 human skeletons were excavated from the 13th to 17th centuries, which are now the body for our research project. And we, this is who we are. We are an interdisciplinary consortium of historians, Bart Lambert, archaeologists, myself, chemists, namely Christophe Snoek and Philip Kleijs, and specialists in human anatomy, Steven Provin and Til Snoek. We have 2 PhD students, one in human osteology, Veronica Jackson, and one in isotope analysis, Rachel Spross. They are both archaeologists by formation and specialized in the medical and natural sciences. Veronica, on the left, works with Steven and Til in the medical faculty, and Rachel, on the right, works with Philippe and Christophe in the chemist department in the science faculty. And the questions we want to ask is, first of all, of course, the demography via the osteology, which is to tell us about cities' gender and age distribution, and about age and disease relations. But also, we want to study the isotopes, the strontium and oxygen isotopes, for instance, in human tissue, animal and bone appetite, to reveal people's regions of origin, while we can also study hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur isotopes from collagen in order to study the diets. And via more complex study of the demographic analysis, more complex analysis of the demography of the medieval population of Ypres, we want to study mortality spikes, to discern mortality spikes which reflect times of crisis such as epidemics and widespread famine. We also want to examine whether certain people are more susceptible to certain diseases than others due to either their genetic predispositions or because of external factors such as age, sex, diet, living conditions, and socioeconomic status. And finally, we are also interested in studying the ways in which a disease is transmitted, which is a kind of a very contemporary question, of course, about how plagues spread amongst populations. We only started the projects. At this moment, we are studying the first 40 to 50 skeletons, but we have time until 2024, and then we hope to give you answers on all of these questions, and indeed to contribute as MERC case study as well to this understanding of changes, understanding of urbanism on health in the past, in order to have a better understanding of the present. And we will disseminate our results via several initiatives with the City Museum, with the Heritage Agency, and other partners. We thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dries. It's I feel that it's very courageous of everyone to make these presentations. It kind of draws energy away from the real life people. When you all these people you know very well, they're so much more lively in real life than can come across here. So I really appreciate the subjecting yourselves to that. We're going to move on now to looking at a case study which we're hoping to use for the promoting care and protection, and this is Rowena Banerjea's All Along the Watchtowers project. And this is very scientific, but it's also it's very much about informing us how these structures, these castles, should be looked after. So I will stop talking and we can hear from herself, and we'll probably hear how her name is properly pronounced.
Hello everyone, I'm Rowena Banerjea from the University of Reading. The case study that I'm going to present today relates to the Manifesto's third guiding principle to promote care and protection. The name of the project is All Along the Watchtowers, Balancing Heritage Protection, Development and Scientific Research on Buried Archaeology at European Castles. The project developed a framework for geoarchaeological research at European castles to target archaeologists, castle curators and heritage management policymakers, so that our guidance can influence their future excavation strategies and conservation plans. The buried or below ground archaeology at castle sites can be exceptionally well preserved because of its burial under masonry, but is often overlooked in conservation and management plans in favour of standing remains. It provides a lens through which we can examine important phases and hiatuses in the developmental history of these monuments. Soil micromorphology itself is a technique that reveals the dynamic histories within the buried archaeology at these monuments, and it can also identify potential threats to the buried archaeology and the processes by which archaeological materials in the ground decay. Before I introduce the project, I'd like to acknowledge all my partners on the project without whom the project wouldn't be possible. And I'd like to draw particular attention to my geoarchaeology colleagues who've all contributed scientific data to the project. This project reviews the state of archaeological remains within a selection of medieval castle sites across Europe, shown here on the right. And these sites represent a diverse range of cultural and environmental contexts. The project examines the scientific value and potential threats to the buried archaeology based on geoarchaeological research. Archaeological soil and sediment micromorphological data can be used to understand the development of castles, the activities and use of space at the sites, and using these data to examine the links between castles and their hinterlands, and the factors that affect the preservation of stratigraphy and materials. And here on this map, you can see the broad geographical distribution of our sites. The colours correspond to the colours on the boxes on the right. So before I start introducing some of our results, I'd like to explain what soil micromorphology is. Soil micromorphology is a geoarchaeological technique, and it allows us to basically conduct an excavation under the microscope. So you can see this top photo here. You can see I'm collecting a sample in a tin, and this allows us to keep the sample intact. So we take it back to the lab and we put resin into that block. It's then cured and we can cut the block into slabs, mount these slabs onto glass slides, and then grind them down to a standard geological thickness of 30 microns, which you can see at the bottom here. This is the finished product, what we call a thin section. And this is examined using a polarizing microscope at magnifications of times 40 to times 630. And it helps us to refine the stratigraphic sequence at very high resolution to look at the depositional and post-depositional events that have taken place on the site. Castles are monuments with their own complex life histories or biographies, and this term refers to the dynamic chronologies of its establishment, development, architectural modification, abandonment, post-abandonment, as well as its diachronic use. So here at Geneva Castle, samples were collected from turf walls, which you can see over on the right, eroded lime mortar down at the bottom, excellent preservation of child remains, that's the top image, and soil horizons from the post-abandonment phase. So this site is a fantastic example to understand the abandonment and post-abandonment processes of the monuments. For castles with standing remains, these are really important phases in their history to understand when it comes to any conservation, restoration work, and to understand any future use of the monument. Here at Melina, soil micromorphological data from profiles within the citadel, shown in the top right photo, and the 12th century church, shown in the bottom right photograph, show alternating periods of habitation, occupation, abandonment, and post-abandonment occupation. And these data show the changing nature of occupation within this area of the citadel from the Islamic to Christian period, which could indicate a change in its role. So the very earliest Islamic floors at the bottom of the profile were kept very clean. There's very little in the way of buildup of refuse. However, the later medieval plaster floors at the top are interspersed with a lot of occupation refuse, including animal dung, which very much shows that this space was used in a different way in these two periods. The castles that I'm showing next are examples of how micromorphology illuminates the buried archaeology of the early occupation and the activities. So Elbląg, Kessel, Caen and Gienne were all excavated ahead of development. Elbląg in Poland, there are no standing remains left of the castle, and the samples come from the earliest timber phase, and the castle is now the site of the Castle Museum. In Kessel, the work was conducted ahead of a new elevator shaft, and Gienne is now a 15th century manor house and the site of the National Museum of Hunting. There are very few standing remains left at Carksey Castle, and like Elbląg, we excavated a partially waterlogged profile, and the deposits formed rapidly between AD 1266 and 1290. So the photographs on the left show the profile through the earliest occupation and use of the outer ward at the Castle of Elbląg, and timbers at the bottom were dated to 1245. So you can see on the profile photograph we have the bands, these sort of black or amorphous deposits, and then darker grey clay deposits. We have boxes in blue, green, yellow and orange that correspond with the micromorphology samples, and you can see the slides that were taken from each of those samples outlined in the middle with the corresponding colour. So the micromorphology revealed that the outer ward was first used to keep small herbivores, so units 23B, 26.1 and 26.3. So these were deposits of possible caprine dung, and then larger herbivores, probably horses, in units 16A4 and 18B. 18B is desiccated herbivore dung, so slightly oxidized. Then 16A4 is like a jellified crust that has formed on the top of it. And the sequence showed regular flooding events attested by deposits of alluvial sediment. And these are 26.2, 25, 23A and 16A3. Attempts were made to raise the floor because of the flooding through the deposition of a brushwood platform, and this is unit 20B. So 16A4, this sort of jellified crust, you can see what this looks like under the microscope in photomicrograph C, and embedded within that was an intestinal parasite egg, and this is photomicrograph D. And photomicrographs F, G and H show the fodder that was ingested by the horses. So this is within units 16A4 and 18B, the larger herbivores. And the phytoliths, so these are biogenic silica plant microfossils, show that these are from grain. So they were fed a grain-based diet with some pasture, and you can see there's a grass seed, which is letter H. And the smaller herbivores have a sort of different phytolith assemblage, showing that they were also given foliage, possibly some leaf fodder. So the next two castles are Hasil in the Netherlands and Gitte in France. Neither of the profiles from these castles were waterlogged, unlike Elbląg, but they do show the use of early timber structures. Both sites show two contrasting preservation conditions, showing the use of straw mats. So in Hasil, the floor coverings, which you can see on the scans of the thin section on the right, the grass mats, the organics, are indicated by the iron replacement of organics, forming these orange striations. Whereas at Gitte, mats are identified through this sort of vegetable material on top of constructed clay floors. So by again the phytolith remains, so the microfossil remains of the plants. So there are two different substrates. So the Hasil site is on sand, whereas the Gitte site is on a calcareous alluvium. Partial waterlogging and burial at Carksey has led to very good preservation of the late 13th century midden deposits. So you can see here in the thin section on the left, the blue circles mark hazelnut shell, so fragments of the hazelnut shell, and the yellow ovals show bone fragments. And the photomicrograph in the centre shows in a bit more detail under the microscope the makeup of this. So you can see we have fish bone in there, for example. Also lots of wood, plant tissue and burnt eggshell. You can see what burnt eggshell looks like from this photo on the right, and this is from Gitte. So also at Gitte, we find crop processing residues in the form of articulated phytoliths from wheat and other cereals, and the scale here is 25 microns. So I mentioned the different ways in which straw mats were preserved at Hasil and Gitte, arising from the different geological substrates. And this also affects the way that dung is preserved at the various sites. So if we take the top images first, on the left, the coprolite from KN is slightly desiccated, whereas the ones from Carksey, this was from a partially waterlogged profile, are still very intact, and you can see the fragments of millet still embedded within it. The bottom images are from Melina de Aragon, and the sample was taken on an interface between two different geologies and from a profile that had been left exposed. So this profile had been cut to do an architectural survey, and you can see the dung is degraded, and it's only really identifiable by the presence of calcareous fecal spherulites that are about 10 microns in size and form in the guts of certain herbivores. So on this slide on the right, I've summarised some of the factors that affect preservation that should be considered in the management decisions for the buried archaeology at castle sites. And on the left, the types of feature that micromorphology identifies to inform about the preservation and decay of materials. So I just want to pick out here later human interventions. And we saw at Melina, particularly the exposed profiles from the architectural surveys and the effect that that had on preservation of dung, for example. At Hasil, The excavation took place due to the construction of a lift shaft, which exposed the buried archaeology. And this brings me on to the next slide, looking at human threats. So human threats can encompass activities such as restoration, excavation, and the use of castles for activities such as being a hotel. Castles make very nice hotels and people want to stay in them. We advocate a minimum of a soil micromorphological approach to understanding the chemical weathering, decay and bioturbation effects to the buried archaeology at these sites. And we're not suggesting anything expensive and time-consuming, such as in situ monitoring or preservation. In terms of outputs, we're preparing two main publications relating to the buried archaeology. The publication from Workshop 1 will present exactly how micromorphology is used to understand and how it can protect the buried archaeology. The publication from Workshop 2 has proved a bit more of a discussion point. While current European legislation relating to the management and protection of castles, so the Amsterdam Declaration, the Valletta Treaty, European Charter of Architectural Heritage, while they come from overarching international guidelines, such as the Venice Charter, subsequently reinterpreted by UNESCO and ICOMOS, who established the International Scientific Committee on Fortification and Military Heritage in 2005, there are still other issues at the national level. The Middle Ages were a formative period in European history, and the impact of ideologically driven conflicts has been appropriated into modern politics in some countries and steered some of the heritage management decisions and research frameworks for castles. As well as the political factors, there are different issues relating to the cost and access to scientific resources in each country. Therefore, rather than trying to impose guidelines, we are producing a research framework for the geoscientific investigation and management of the buried archaeology at castles. So looking at the type of excavation and why geoarchaeology should be appropriate, and proposing a series of research questions for castles and what technique is appropriate to answer them. So if you would like to follow up the project, you can consult some of the further reading in addition to our website. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rowena, and I particularly want to thank you for the Bob Dylan reference, which kind of actually made my throwaway about being a DJ seem less throwaway. I also want to apologize for the glitches. I don't really know what that's about, and I definitely wish that we could go back to 35mm slides where you could actually see what was going wrong when it went wrong. Anyway, that won't happen. What I want to do now is move on to introduce Carenza Lewis, who is Professor of Public Understanding and Research at the University of Lincoln. But more to the point, she's one of our leading medieval archaeologists and currently is the president of the Society for Medieval Archaeology. And she has a long-standing research experience working on rural settlement, and also she for many years has been engaged with public-oriented public engagement and participatory archaeology, and she's going to talk about how that's been working out in her CORES project, which we propose to use as one of the Creating Knowledge case studies. So let's go.
Hello, I'm Professor Carenza Lewis from the University of Lincoln in the UK, and I'm going to be talking about the currently occupied rural settlement project in England. This was a programme of research into medieval rural settlement development, and the project aimed to advance knowledge and understanding of today's villages, small towns, hamlets and farms through the excavation of 1 metre square test pits. The project started in 2005 and the fieldwork finished in 2018, after which analysis and publication is proceeding. The background to the project was that a lot of research in England has been carried out into rural settlement, but most of that had focused on deserted and very extensively shrunken sites. The archaeology there is easily accessible, and it's also reasonably easy to predict that archaeological features will survive because there's nothing sitting on top of them. And excavation and fieldwork on these sites has told us a huge amount. But the problem is that deserted sites are only a tiny minority. Probably only about 10% of settlements that existed in the medieval period in England became permanently deserted. And those 10% are also atypical. They're on the average smaller, they're poorer, they're less favourably located, and they tend to appear later in the documentary records. On top of that, they're very unevenly distributed, as you can see from this map. So we felt that to get a more representative understanding of medieval settlement, we needed to look at that other 90%, or at least the sample of them, the silent majority of non-deserted settlements that we termed currently occupied rural settlements, a term that made no presumption about their origins or how long or continuously they'd been inhabited. The CAUSE project ended up working on 80 different settlements, but it started off on just half a dozen or so. We used test pit excavation, and that's because it's a great solution to the problem of working in currently occupied rural settlements where you've got today's houses and shops and schools and roads and so on. 1 metre square test pits are small, so they can be fitted into unbuilt up space like gardens. They're quick to dig, so the garden owners are likely to let you excavate a test pit, and also they're small so they don't make much mess. And the aim, which needs good support from local communities, is to excavate as many test pits as possible across as much as possible of the currently occupied rural settlement. The method's very simple. You lay out 1 metre square, you dig down it in layers, you sieve the soil or sort the soil for fines, and then you put the soil back and replace the turf. We use written guidelines and paper pro forma recording to ensure each test pit was excavated and recorded to the same standards. All the test pits were excavated in 10 centimetre spits, with the fines kept separate from each spit, and each spit was given a different context number. Using this standardised written methodology meant that all of the test pits, whoever was excavating them, were completed to the same standard, which meant lots more people could be involved, which meant we could excavate more test pits. So the archaeological results have been enormous from 80 settlements. I'll show you just one, which is from Purton in Hertfordshire. You can see the map of England here. The red dot shows the location of Purton, so it's in sort of central southern England. And there's a photograph at the bottom of the page just showing you what the village looks like today. You can see from the aerial image that it's a nucleated settlement with all of the settlement tightly clustered together and fields around. So we could develop from this a series of distribution maps, and on each of these the white squares show the location of one of those 1 metre square test pits that didn't produce any pottery of this date, and the black circles are the test pits that did produce pottery of that date. And the bigger the pottery, the bigger the circle, the more pottery that turned up. So this is a map showing the distribution of Roman pottery. And you can see from this very clearly that there's a large linear settlement on the northwest side of the map along the edge of a small stream. And then there's a small cluster of pits which are producing pottery in the southeast corner, the bottom right-hand corner of the map, and really nothing in between. And you can even see, looking back at the top northwest corner, you can even see a sort of penumbra of test pits with very small numbers, just tiny single abraded sherds, which looks like those might be the fields of the Roman settlement. So moving forward in time into the early Anglo-Saxon period, we can see a really different distribution. There's no pottery of that date from anywhere on that settlement on the northwest side of the map. And in fact, only one test pit out of 114 that were excavated altogether produced even a single sherd of pottery at this date, right on the southeast side of the settlement, quite close to some of that Roman pottery, and possibly part of a bigger area that extended beyond the area that's inhabited today. But certainly there's a major disjunction with the Roman evidence. Into the late Anglo-Saxon period, the 9th to 11th century, we can see very clearly we've got a nucleated settlement formed in the centre of the settlement here with a big red circle around it. And you can also see there's a cluster of a lot of test pits producing a lot of pottery on the southern side of the map. That's very much either side of a later 12th century castle, and it just hints at the possibility that that was a pre-Norman elite site as well. Into the high medieval period, the 12th to 14th century, we see the settlement absolutely exploding in size and density. Nearly every test pit's producing large amounts of pottery, and we can see entirely new sections appearing circled in red here, including one just on the west side of that newly founded 12th century castle. It's like a planned extension to that settlement. The only place that seems not to have any pottery is the area circled in green now, which looks like perhaps a village green. It's today just near the village pond. In the later medieval period, the later 14th to mid-16th century, we see a collapse in the number of sites producing pottery. Several streets seem to be entirely deserted, and the number of pits overall producing pottery drops from 91 to 32. Not until the later 16th or 17th century does the number of pits producing pottery start to pick up again. And even 400 years after the 14th century, Purton has not regained its pre-14th century size or density. Now, because we've carried out excavation on so many cores in this project, any evidence we can find can be seen in context. So any one place can be compared to the others. So we can look at the graph for Purton, shown in red here, compare it with the average of all of those 70 sites in East Anglia. We can see that Purton's got more than average in the way of Roman, early Anglo-Saxon, middle Anglo-Saxon, pretty much on average. More dynamic growth in the late Anglo-Saxon period into the high medieval, and then a really sharp drop afterwards, and then it more or less follows the average climb back, slow climb back after that. One insight, and there are many that have come out of this data, but one insight I'll just talk quickly about is what it's telling us about the impact of the Black Death. And you can see this graph shows 6 main periods, and the 2 that are circled are on the left. It's the high medieval period, the 12th to 14th century, and on the right it's the late medieval period, the 14th to 16th century. And you can see the drop there, and you notice that at Purton, that 91 to 30 or so pits drop. Now, the Black Death is famous as a pandemic of plague from 1346 to 1353. It swept across the old world, but it's very difficult to assess the actual impact of it because documentary evidence is very sparse, even from England, which is relatively well recorded. We don't have population data, we can use tax records as a proxy, but they're very sparse and not entirely reliable and infrequently collected, whereas individual manorial records that record mortalities are few and far between. There's only a couple of dozen, and in those the mortality rates vary from 0 to 100%, so it's very difficult to extrapolate from that. Analysis of the cores test pit data across those 75 settlements in East Anglia and another 5 more widely across the country, as you can see on the map here, show precisely actually what that drop is after the 14th century Black Death. We look at the figures. 40% of test pits produce pottery dating to the couple of centuries before the Black Death, but only just over 20% produce pottery dating to the couple of centuries after the Black Death. And of course we can also see this mapped. So here you can see the whole of that East Anglia region where most of our research was focused. The bigger the circle, the higher the percentage of excavated test pits that were producing pottery. This is the before the mid-14th century map. And here's the after the mid-14th century map. And you can see that drop. 90%, in fact, of the settlements that we excavated in showed a decline in the number of pits producing pottery after the 14th century. And overall, the number of individual test pits with pottery drops by about 45%. So we can use that as a proxy for the drop in population, probably around 45%. So the core's test pit data is providing actually an entirely new way to both reconstruct and measure the impact of the Black Death and its aftermath. The 14th century had a succession of events that conspired to reduce the population, and in England it took more than 200 years to begin to recover. Of course, by being able to map this data and in fact collect it from anywhere we want to, we can see where that impact was most severe. So the areas circled in black here have high percentages of pits producing pottery before the Black Death, but afterwards we can see how hollowed out those areas become. And in fact, particularly on the western periphery of our area, if we take out the one place that really does look quite major, which is Risley there, that data is skewed by the fact there's a late medieval pottery production site there. So if we take that out, we can see even more clearly quite how extreme the contrast is in those areas that were particularly badly affected. And then, of course, we can compare that data with other data and see how strongly the test pit data for severe depopulation or reduced population correlates with other phenomena such as the areas of open field system rather than enclosed pastoral landscapes, which is the area shown in dark green on the map on the left, and also how closely it correlates with the distribution of deserted sites, which from our data it would seem are only the tip of the iceberg of settlement depopulation. And we can then start to look at other data. Now we've seen this picture, we've started to go back and look at other forms of data. So completely different analysis looking at animal bone fragments showed again a huge drop in the number of animal bone fragments, saying something about the number of people who are alive to eat animals. And looking at, again, a very different set of data, non-coin small finds recovered by metal detectorists. Again, you can see from the graph at the bottom of the page, there's a sharp drop, again dating to the later 14th century. But it's not just an archaeological new visions that this research has given us. The CAUSE project has been socially engaged, very publicly engaged from its inception. It works in the places that people are living in. It has to be, but it also wanted to be. From the very start, most of the people carrying out the excavation were teenagers who were taking part as a way of raising their aspirations and building skills for their educational future and for going to university. Thousands, more than 8,000 teenagers took part in the project, and we collected data. So we know that more than 80% finished it feeling more positive about going to university, and we actually assessed the individual skills they gained. Verbal communication, structured working, creative thinking, reflective learning, effort and persistence, team working, all these sorts of skills. We can actually assess how well they are gaining those skills, so we know how they benefited. And then we also looked at the benefits to the community volunteers, because increasingly members of the public in the villages, particularly those where there have been school projects, got interested, and then other villages heard about the project. Again, thousands of people have been involved. Those 114 test pits at Purton built up year on year. We did 5 test pits in the first year there with the school group, and then local community got involved. The following year we did another 20 or so, another 20 or so in the year after that, more in the year after that, and in the year after that. So it was as a community project that we were able to get that huge amount of data showing us that development in the village over nearly 2,000 years. And again, we've looked at the benefits to community volunteers, and recently we've actually worked with psychologists to identify precisely what those benefits are. We get fantastic feedback, everyone really enjoys it, they feel more engaged with their local heritage and so on. But we've actually looked at the data, we've done before and after surveys with control groups, and we can see that there are impacts on, for example, people's feeling of life satisfaction. The blue line here is the test pitting volunteers, and the red line is the control group living in the same village but not taking part. We can see the impact on their feeling of social support, of feeling that people are there for them in their community, again, rises. And their sense of place attachment as well. It's higher in people who get involved with the community test pitting before it starts, but it's even higher by the time they've finished. And this project is also now inspiring similar work in Europe, currently working in the Netherlands, the Czech Republic and Poland, with other work hopefully going to take place elsewhere. So in conclusion then, this project has completed more than 2,500 test pit excavations in 80 English rural settlements. It's generated a vast amount of new archaeological data, which are advancing our understanding of the development of those individual settlements and aggregated, revealing bigger pictures of change over time in events such as the Black Death, covering the whole of the medieval millennium, particularly from the 6th century to the 16th, while at the same time connecting people living in those communities with their medieval heritage in ways that benefit them, their communities, the places they're in, and research as well, and is now being extended to Europe. There have been a huge number of people involved in this project, thousands and thousands. Some of them are acknowledged here, and there are a number of publications as well where you can find out more about the detail behind what I've been talking about if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carenza. I think that nicely encapsulates the benefits of the community participation and how that actually materially helps us advance, create new knowledge. So the final presentation we have for today is really to look more closely at how we can promote engagement with the medieval past. And this is based on, our example, our case study is to do with the mapping the archaeological sources for Prague. And we're very pleased that Hasil, who is in the faculty of Charles University and Institute of Archaeology of the Czech Republic, is able to participate in this and contribute to this. He's one of considerable experience of archaeological mapping in the Republic. And I also want to thank Jakub Sawicki, because he also of the Institute of Archaeology in Czech Republic, because he's kind of facilitated this presentation. So maybe we should kick it off now, Megan.
Hello everyone. In this short presentation, we would like to introduce you to a project which is currently finished. The project is called Prague Archaeological. And the main idea of the project was to digitalize archaeological sources and knowledge of town archaeology in theory and practice. The outcomes of the project you can see already on the web, so you can see the link in the first slide here. The project was funded by the Ministry of Culture of the Czech Republic and was run mostly by the team of the Institute of Archaeology of the Czech Academy of Science in Prague. There were many institutions involved in creation of this project, among others, of course, the Czech Institute of Archaeology, of the Czech Academy of Science, National Heritage Institute, or the Museum of City of Prague. And one of the ideas was to concentrate all the data that was in the archives of those different institutions in one virtual environment to make research and heritage management more easier and more accessible. But of course, also we wanted to be sure that this dissemination of this knowledge is easier and accessible to researchers, but also to the wider public, to people interested in the history of Prague, or of course, or the archaeology itself. And the last but not least idea of the project was to use those new media channels which can focus on the archaeology of Prague. So in the project itself, there is quite a lot of visualizations made on YouTube or in the Sketchfab. So how it is done? The Prague Archaeological is a portal which is a component of much larger archaeological information system of the Czech Republic. It's providing the backbone evidence system of archaeology in Bohemia and Moravia, which is the archaeological map of the Czech Republic, which collects the data about historical, current and planned excavations in Czech Republic, and also a digital archive of different documents, map, plans, and photographs. The backbone of this information system is complemented by specialized interfaces oriented on different publics. So we have Archaeological Atlas of Bohemia and Moravia, which is educational web for wider public, Archaeology Online, which is a web oriented on presentation of archaeologically relevant datasets, and also general API, so application programming interface, and backend services for data exchange. Especially here with the project Ariadne Plus catalog and Prague Archaeological as virtual research environment focused only on Prague. So as you can see, the Prague Archaeological is a part of larger project. Of course, the principles of the archaeological information system of the Czech Republic cannot be explained in just few words, but there is already an English monograph with everything written in it, so you can check it online. So how does it look, the portal itself? The Prague Archaeological is of course, web portal, which is focused on also different aspects. First one is dedicated to professionals, so mostly to archaeologists, but not only. But also the larger part of the whole portal and of the whole project is dedicated to the general public. The portal provides not only archaeological research data, but is also evidence of monuments in Prague and other protected areas, and includes linked data to the official monument catalog, which is run by National Heritage Institute. The archaeological areas in the city center of Prague are mapped as important archaeological areas, so you can browse the map of entire Prague and choose specific archaeological sites. There is also a map layer showing archaeological objects preserved in situ, and also you can reconstruct the map of the old Prague, so the Prague in the past. Several map layers are keeping information about building, archaeology, science, in archaeology, geological conditions, as well as written sources. All of those map layers can be shown together in a map window, and you can then filter different attributes and supplement those by general map background, so you can have historical maps, aerial and orthophoto maps, cadastral maps, and OpenStreetMaps. One of the main ideas was to build a community around the portal. So first of all data contained in the portal is without exceptions accessible for reading and downloading without any kind of login. So by under the 3.0 license of Creative Commons, so it's like non-commercial and non-derivates. On this diagram, you see how this data flow is going from the different sources, so from National Heritage Archives, from Institute of Archaeology in Prague archives, and also data of third parties, and how it's made that they are accessible to, well, of course, state and public administration, heritage management, but also field archaeologists and other researchers, and, which is very important, to broad public. The accessibility of data to the wider public was one of the reasons to create the project. So the large part of the Prague Archaeological web portal is strictly dedicated to general audience. There is, for instance, a module for multimedia presentations with WordPress backend, and it's connected to the map interface. So, for instance, the presentations can be ordered into a guide, a real life guide to the archaeology of Prague. One of the outcomes of the project was also publishing a book, a guide to Prague archaeology, known, unknown, and hidden monuments. It already had 2 editions, and they are both sold out. We are working currently on the English version of this book. The portal itself and the books are connected with QR codes, so you can easily find specific places on the web and also in the book. The portal is also providing new media channels. It allows us to reach a larger audience. For instance, this short movie on YouTube had over 1 million of visitors with unique IP addresses and nearly 9,000 likes. We would like to close our presentation with another visualization showing currently not existent Gothic mausoleum, which used to be at the Charles Square in Prague and was founded by King Wenceslaw IV. Thank you very much for watching us. Well, at the end, we need to say that the main part of the project is already finished, but the portal itself is still under development, and there is still a lot of work that we need to do. However, we invite you to check the portal by yourself, and of course, to visit Prague. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you too. That was really it's very exciting to see, having stumbled around Prague a few years ago after one of the EAs, but without the benefit of that. I need to go back and make use of those resources. What I would like to do now is to invite a few of the people who've agreed to be discussants to say a few words, and then we'll open things up a little bit more. So, and this would be maybe a time if people have urgent issues or questions to bang them into the Q&A so we can identify them and try to organize the discussion. I realize we're getting close to the time we scheduled for this. We can overrun for a while. We're not going to be thrown out of the building just yet, but we won't. Obviously, people's patience and tiredness and will kick in as well. But hopefully, we'll have a little bit of time here to have a bit of a discussion. So, can we begin with my colleague John Raven, who's works for Historic Environment Scotland, and who's been co-collaborator on this series of workshops.
I just want to say thanks to all the contributors. You've seen a kind of a great kind of set display of kind of some brilliant research projects taken across Europe, and I think it's worth. They've all, as they were intended to do, kind of highlighted aspects of the manifesto as we in action, and that kind of really that heritage wheel. It kind of in process, and it kind of really demonstrates a lot of the kind of papers have really demonstrated the benefits of kind of academic collaboration, but we've also seen that how that can kind of benefit from working with communities, and also kind of how that then impacts on kind of heritage managers, and that kind of really kind of brings us back to reminding us, if we really need to remind ourselves in a way, that that medieval period really formed the built environment and the landscapes around us. And it's also reminds us, if we need reminding, particularly within this group, that all that really does is kind of add value. All that understanding and research and kind of working with others really adds value to our kind of the remains of our medieval past, and also raises its profile, and then kind of, which in turn influences decision makers. And what we're really trying to do, kind of, as well as kind of promote good quality research through the manifesto, is also use the manifesto to kind of help influence sustainable and informed decision making, and kind of how our societies and the places that we live in develop. And what we've really seen that kind of cycle in full, from kind of researchers through communities, heritage managers, and ultimately kind of politicians who make those kind of final decisions about how we live. And that's kind of despite kind of, I think, kind of going back to something Steve mentioned earlier, that's despite quite a significant range of different legal, planning and political systems in that we live. So hopefully that will inspire us to move forward from here.
Thank you very much, John. I wonder if we could now turn to Natascha Mehler, who has kindly offered to say a few words about her perspective on this, and particularly perhaps challenge us with our the end of our period.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. They were really wonderful, and I enjoyed all of them a lot. It's amazing to see all the broad perspectives on the medieval past. And thank you, Stephen, for giving me the opportunity to raise a couple of things in the manifesto, and maybe we can discuss here within the group or also with the audience a couple of things. To go back a bit, I'm a medieval and post-medieval archaeologist, and I always worked in both periods. And I would say that in my native Germany and in Austria and in Switzerland, most people who are educated in medieval archaeology are also educated in post-medieval archaeology to some degree, because there is no longer a disciplinary divide between the two. And that's my background, and that is why I would like to express my concern with the time frame of the manifesto, particularly with the term medieval. I know I'm a bit of a troublemaker within MERC, but since Stephen has given me the chance to say a couple of words, I thought I could. So that's what I'm doing now. I think the heritage that we see in our cities and landscapes, it matters a lot, and it doesn't matter to me whether it's a medieval or post-medieval heritage. But since we exclusively use the term medieval in our manifesto, I'm a bit worried that a couple of places or centers or regions in Europe will feel locked out from the present manifesto text. Cities with a rich cultural heritage, for example, like Göteborg in Sweden or Glückstadt in Germany or Palma Nova in Italy, who all founded in the early modern period, they will not really feel included. Of course, I know the manifesto does say on page 2 how the manifesto understands medieval, and we have put it very broadly from the 5th century to the 17th century. That's fair enough, that's very good. But still, to most Europeans, when they read medieval, that's medieval, no matter how broad we define the frame. To most people in Europe, I think medieval does not go beyond the 15th or early 16th centuries. So I'm a bit worried about our use of the term medieval. And I think we all agree that the main point, or one of the main points of the manifesto, is that it tells us why the past matters, and if we want to shape, how it matters if we shape our future. And I think that also the younger cultural heritage is just for that also very relevant. Of course, I'm immediately thinking of the archaeology of the more recent past, or very recent past, or contemporary archaeology, and the several thousands of camps of the Nazis in Europe, for example. So I really would like to find a way how we could include the more recent past in the manifesto. In the heritage wheel in the manifesto, we highlight that we need to understand values. But I do feel that our manifesto, with its present focus on the medieval period, is not really appreciating the value of the post-medieval or modern period. And I want to remind you that within the EAA, MERC is the only body that looks after the heritage of the more recent past, or the medieval past. And I guess that's why it also falls into the responsibility of MERC to look at the more recent past. Now, whether we need to reshape MERC to include the modern period or not is a totally different matter, and it shall not be discussed here. I just wanted to point out that in many Central European countries, and the national associations that initially looked after the medieval archaeology have over the last years or even decades started to also look after the post-medieval period. And if I may say so, the focus of MERC isn't then really up to date with the recent developments in many, at least Central European countries within academia and heritage. But the manifesto, I think, is a unique chance to also include the archaeology of the more recent past and to support this archaeology of the more recent past. And we very much need that as well. So maybe we can think about how we can open up the manifesto a bit more, maybe just by adding a case study that highlights the value of the archaeology of the modern period, for example. I'm absolutely open for anything, but I just wanted to make my point clear here. Thank you.
Thank you. And with the characteristic eloquence, you've kind of brought these issues back into our attention and really, in a way, slightly shamed us in the sense that we know this is an important issue, and we've kind of struggled to see how we could cope with that. So I think as we, perhaps with a bit of distance now, the ink is slightly dry on that draft, we can maybe see how we could incorporate a bit more space to allow this later evidence to and importance of that evidence to be more clearly understood. And I think a good case study might really be the thing. And in a way, I imagine that some of the stuff, for instance, I imagine the Prague case study has lots of stuff which is, not technically medieval, lots of sites which aren't. So in a way, we can draw that out. And Carenza also didn't stop at the Middle Ages, you know, she's carried on. So I think that we kind of do it, but maybe we need to say we're doing it. And I think, well, we can communicate if for suggestions of a suitable case study. I mean, it's something which has to be, you know, which kind of does that business. We can maybe think about that, and we can have a wee correspondence about that offline, as it were. So thank you very much for that, Natascha. I wonder if we could hear from Carlo now. Carlo, you'll see that although Rowena was able to mention a number of sites in Southern Europe doesn't really feature in our case studies at the moment, and maybe there are specific issues and questions which we have to face up to when we start thinking about Southern Europe. So take it away.
Thank you, Stephen. First of all, let me make a note on what Natascha said. Actually, when we are making project in so-called marginal areas, and marginal is still an adjective that I hate to use, but it's in literature. I often find that the end of the Middle Ages is 1964, when I was born. When they built new roads, they introduced gasoline in engine, and they introduced fertilizers in agriculture, and this changed completely the way people used to get water from the source instead of pipeline. And in this countryside, I can find continuities from the Bronze Age to the 20th century. So the problem is not only to extend in one way, but also in another way. And I think that wisely in the text of our manifesto, we acknowledge that there is an extension. We are aware that there is an extension before and after what we conventionally state as the Middle Ages. And yes, in Southern Europe, the problem is mismanagement. When Stephen asked me a case study to show good practices in Italy of heritage management, I was, oh my God. I can list hundreds of cases of management of heritage, which started as, well, we will win, we will be the good practice, we will be a forerunner. And after 2-3 years, everything is finished. But it is not finished because there is a terrorist attack, or because someone is against the project of promoting the heritage and managing the heritage. And this could be something we can fight against, because there is an enemy, and we know where is the enemy. On the contrary, it is simply that things loosen, because people is no more interested. Politicians change, and they can only plan what happens within their 4-year term. After their term, nothing must happen, because the successor cannot be eased to do things. So there is no way to plan something which lasts more than 4 years. And this happens to the Colosseum, or Pompeii, as well as for many, many monasteries, castles, and churches all around Italy. In my small province, we have nearly 200 medieval castles and nearly the same number of medieval churches still preserved. We have 4 towns that used to be from the Etruscans to the Middle Ages, even modern times. So many settlements, but there is no, we have a great research, but we have very few examples of good management, good practices. In southern Europe, the Mediterranean, I can think some cases in Spain, for instance, but with many difficulties. And that's the real problem we face today. So I do apologize, Stephen, but as I told you, I couldn't tell you that San Vincenzo al Volturno is a best practice, because if you go there without a machine to cut the trees and the grass, you cannot see even the main buildings. And I'm not sure that if you go alone without someone who takes you there, you will be safe. Because as I told you, the Roman villa of Faragola, one of the most beautiful 6th century Roman villas in the Mediterranean, was burned by mafia. And so it's a problem.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Carlo. I'm sorry we kind of lowered the tone there a wee bit. It was looking kind of positive, and there was lots of success. And obviously, I think maybe we need to think that some of the, I guess one of the expectations we have with the manifesto is it will help to turn it around in areas where the perceptions still need to be.
I think we should change the attitude, because, for instance, we made the archaeological park of Rocca San Silvestro, Parchi Valdicornia, is one of the oldest parks, 25 years ago. And it was made by my teacher, Riccardo Frankovic. It was pushed by the administrations, by the region, okay? And after 10 years, it started decreasing, and now it's one of thousands of institutions without money and with a very red balance and no perspectives, because they cannot really raise money from new activities, even if they could some public engagement. But as I saw in these presentations, and I thank all the speakers, there's much more than simple public engagement as we can imagine. So there's much more to learn.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Okay, well, it's become a nice day here. It's probably maybe a nice day where you are as well, and that's maybe enough for one afternoon. I really want to thank you, all you presenters. I certainly find this new speaking to my computer presentation thing very challenging and flattening and jerky, and so I'm very indebted to your contribution there. I think everyone should imagine that the presenters are much more perky and, you know, attractive and lively in real life, as of course we all are. I also want to just slightly apologize for the timekeeping. This is just my experience, not inexperience in working on this thing. This isn't entirely the end of it. As I say, we still need to approve the final version of the text, and then we're working on getting a kind of publication version ready. And then there'll be a kind of long process, I hope it's going to be a long process of dissemination and spreading out the word and obtaining translations so that it goes out in locally influential languages. And above all, I hope that you found this a worthwhile expenditure of a few hours, and that you're inspired to get on with it. So this isn't the end, but it is possibly the end for this afternoon. So can I thank everyone again, and we'll be in touch. I guess we're just at our computers all the time, so you can always get a hold of us. So, shall I say goodbye? I'm saying goodbye. It's been great to see you all, and looking forward to doing it again.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Good.
Hi, guys.
Bye.
Bye.